In this video, I'm going to go over some of the highlights of Chapter 9, which talks about decisions made by firms in a competitive market. So the big questions answered in this chapter are: how do competitive markets work? How do firms maximize profits? And what does the supply curve look like in a perfectly competitive market? So first, just a little bit about what a competitive market is. You can read more about this, but a competitive market is a market where there are lots of buyers and sellers. They're selling similar, or really to be more precise, identical goods. And therefore, firms are price takers. Not only firms, but also customers are price takers in these types of markets because there's so much competition on both sides. So you can think about produce, say several farmers selling exactly the same kind of beans, lined up under a tent. As far as your eyes can see, are farmers selling beans, right? And say the going price for beans is 50 cents per can or something like that. So you think about if a customer walks up and tries to change that price by saying, I'd really prefer to give you 49 cents for these beans. What's the farmer going to say? No, step back, right? Because this is a market in which there are lots of buyers and sellers. So one buyer walking up and saying, I'd rather give you 49 cents than 50, the farmer's going to say, step aside. There's plenty of other buyers out there willing to give me 50 cents, right? So that one buyer has no control over the price. And at the same time, the seller has no control over the price. If the seller decides, oh, I would rather get 51 cents per can, what are the buyers going to say? No, thank you. We'll go to your neighbor who's selling identical beans for just 50 cents, right? So no buyer and no seller has any control over the price. Everyone is a price taker. Where do they take that price from? They take it from the market. So this is the things that we've covered in the previous chapters, this forces of supply and demand. So if you take everyone's willingness to pay and everyone's willingness to sell and combine them into supply and demand, then the market gives you the price, right? The equilibrium price, and everyone just has to accept that price in these types of markets. And then another thing that's going to be key when we think about the long-term effects in these markets, what actually ends up happening in these markets is that there's free entry and free exit into the market and out of the market. So in other words, it's really easy to start selling beans if you want to. And at the same time, it's really easy to stop selling beans if you want to, right? So this is not a market that has really high barriers. It's really easy just to start selling or to stop selling if you want to. Free entry and free exit. So how does a firm maximize profit in this type of market? And the answer really is the same no matter what type of market you're looking at. And it involves marginal revenue and marginal cost. So marginal revenue mathematically is defined like this. So marginal revenue is the change in revenue divided by the change in quantity. So a little delta there meaning change. And really it just in words to describe what that math means, it's how much more revenue do I make by selling one more can of beans? Or we can get even more precise and say by selling one more bean, right? So what's the marginal? If you think about marginal, always means on the edge, on the margin. How much revenue, the marginal revenue, how much revenue will I gain from taking one step? And we can talk about one step forward or one step back. How much revenue will I lose or gain if I sell one fewer cans too? But usually I just think about it in terms of adding one and it's fine. So it's any change, right? So a change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity. Usually in most of the examples you'll look at, that delta Q is just one. So we're thinking about adding one more can of beans. And so it just becomes, what is the change in revenue when I add that one? And marginal cost on the other side is exactly the same idea. It's just cost. So the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity. So if we want to think about profit, remember profit is revenue minus cost. And so it matters when I produce one more can of beans, how much revenue will I get from that one can, the marginal revenue, but it also matters how much did it cost me to make that one can, the marginal cost. So the change in cost divided by change in quantity. What's the extra cost associated with producing one more can of beans? So if we want to think about then our marginal profit, how much profit do I gain from producing and selling that one more can of beans? It's just marginal revenue minus marginal cost. That's my change in profit associated with making and selling that one more can of beans. So then, how do we maximize profit? To maximize profit, of course, you want that delta profit, that change in profit to be positive as long as it can be, right? As long as that's positive, even if it's tiny, if it's positive, it means producing one more can of beans increases your profit. It brings more revenue than it costs you to make it. So as long as that delta profit is positive, you want to keep producing, right? And if that delta profit is negative, it means the cost of producing the next can of beans is greater than the revenue you would get from it. And so, of course, you don't want to do that, right? And so you're going to keep moving forward if marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, and then move backward if marginal revenue is less than marginal cost. And the only place where you're happy, where you're done moving, you don't want to go forward or backward because you've maximized your profit at this point. Moving forward doesn't increase profit and moving backward does not increase profit, is the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, where producing one more can of beans doesn't increase your profit at all and also doesn't decrease your profit at all. This is where you want to stay. This is your happy place. This is where profit is maximized. So the profit maximization rule is always to choose the level of output so that marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And this is always, always, always the profit maximizing rule. This is not only in a perfectly competitive market. This is in every market that we'll discuss moving forward. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost is how you maximize profit. And notice, it's easy to kind of gloss over these words, but we're choosing the level of output, right? So the firm is the one making this choice, and the firm is not choosing a price. They're not choosing anything other than how much should I produce, right? We'll see in a minute when we start to look at the graphs representing these decisions that who chooses the price is actually the customer, right? A lot of times when we think about what's going on in the market, we may think the firm is the one choosing the price and they're imposing this price upon us. That when we walk into the grocery store, we see the price on a can of beans, someone else imposed that upon us. What's actually true is the buyer is who chooses the price for the firm, right? Because what if the firm tries to sell beans for too big a price? Then they can't sell their beans, right? If they try to sell their beans for too low a price, they sell out and then they're thumping themselves because, shoot, I could have made more if I'd raised the price. People were willing to pay more, right? So how does the price get chosen? The price actually gets chosen by the demand side of the market, by the consumer. What are the consumers willing to pay? But if we want to think about how the firm maximizes profit, the only choice the firm has is how much should I produce? And then they have a couple of follow-up choices of how should I produce it, how much should I use people or machines, that sort of stuff. But really, the primary choice that the firm gets to make is what level of output. How many cans of beans should I put on the shelf in order to maximize my profit? And the answer to that is they'll choose their level of output such that marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Because if marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, you want to keep going. You want to keep producing because the revenue from producing one more can of beans is higher than the cost, which means you would increase your profit by moving forward. If the marginal revenue is lower than marginal cost, you need to stop. You may even need to move back, produce fewer than what you're currently producing because it means the cost of producing that next can of beans is higher than the revenue you're getting from it. And so you're actually decreasing your profit by doing that. And so the only place that you're happy, the spot where your profit is maximized, is where your marginal revenue equals marginal cost. If marginal revenue is higher than marginal cost, you increase profit by moving forward. If marginal revenue is less than marginal cost, you increase profit by moving backward. The only place where profit is maximized is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So So the example given in your book is of a snowplow company. That's where this Mr. Plow thing comes from. But so Mr. Plow is gonna maximize his profits where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And here's the thing that's specific. So I told you the profit maximizing rule is not specific to the type of market you're in. That doesn't require that you're in a perfectly competitive market. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost is how you maximize profit no matter what market you're in. But here's the thing that is specific to this type of market. Because we're in a perfectly competitive market, price is the same thing as marginal revenue. Why is that? Well, it's because the firm is a price taker. It doesn't matter how many driveways I plow. It doesn't matter how many cans of beans I sell. I have to sell them for the market price. That price never changes. The price is just what is given to me by the market. And so, what is my extra revenue from selling one more can of beans? It's just whatever that price is, right? So, if beans are going for 50 cents a can and I sell 10 beans today, then I'm making 50 cents times 10, I'm making $5. If I decide tomorrow I want to sell 11 cans of beans, right? Then what is my extra revenue from selling one more can of beans? It's just 50 cents. It's how much I've sold it for. So in a perfectly competitive market where the firm is a price taker and has no control over price at all, the price is the same thing as marginal revenue. So we end up with a graph that looks like this. So you've got your marginal cost curve, your average total cost curve. These are the curves we talked about in the last chapter, in chapter 8. And now the firm is going to add this marginal revenue curve, which in a perfectly competitive market is a flat line because the marginal revenue equals the price, which is just flat, $10. So let's think about then where profit maximization happens on this graph. Profit maximization happens where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. In this graph, where is that? Boop, right here, where the marginal revenue curve crosses the marginal cost curve, right? And remember, the choice the firm is making is the quantity to produce. So you find that point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and you drop down to the quantity axis. It tells you what quantity you should produce. So in this graph, we're talking about driveways plowed. So our snow plow example, this firm should plow 8 driveways. Maximum profit happens where the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Now, when you're doing these, I do recommend you go ahead and draw that dotted line up from that quantity, right? Go ahead and draw this dotted line because that dotted line is what we're going to use to fully analyze everything that's going on in this graph. So you're plowing 8 driveways, you're charging $10 per driveway. The question then becomes, okay, I know I'm maximizing profit because this is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, but how much profit am I making? If that's where I'm maximizing profit, what is my maximum profit? Remember, profit is revenue minus cost, right? And so you want your total revenue minus your total cost. Remember, your total revenue is just your average revenue. In this case, the price. What revenue are you making per item that you sell, right? Times how many you sell. So if the price is $10, you're plowing 8 driveways. What's your revenue? 80, right? It's that average revenue per item, times how many items you sell. So that's my total revenue is 8 times 10. My total cost then is what is my average cost per driveway times how many driveways that I plow. How do I find my average cost? Well, it's given to me by the average total cost curve. So if I'm plowing 8 driveways, come up that dotted line to the average total cost curve, and that tells me, come over to the price axis, the dollars and cents axis, and that tells me for 8 driveways, the average cost, the cost per driveway is $8.75. So what is my total cost? It's 8 times 8.75, right? So if I've got my total revenue is actually the area that it's not shaded here, but it's the area of this big triangle, right? Or rectangle, excuse me. So my total revenue is my average revenue, 10, times my quantity, 8, right? So if you take this side times this side, you get the area of this big rectangle. That's my total revenue. My total cost is my average cost, 8.75, times my number of driveways, 8. And I get the area of this, excuse me, I keep accidentally hitting buttons. I get the area of this uh, rectangle, right? And so if I want to know my revenue minus my cost, it's big rectangle minus smaller rectangle. And what's left over is this area that's shaded green and called profit. So my profit then, if I plow 8 driveways and plow each of them for $10, which again is just the price given to me by the market, then my profit is the rectangle here. In other words, it's the difference between my average revenue and my average cost times how many driveways I plow, right? This makes sense. What's my revenue per driveway minus my cost per driveway? That tells me the profit per driveway, right? My revenue per driveway divided by or minus my cost per driveway tells me my profit per driveway. And again, remember, per driveway just it means average. So that average total cost is the cost per driveway. And if I take the profit per driveway, multiply it by the number of driveways, I have my total profit. Total profit is always the rectangle between your average total cost and your price. All right, so this rectangle between average total cost and price, and then the width of that rectangle is just your quantity.